Welcome back to Untangling Web3.
We've got another great episode for you today, but before that, we'd love it if you could drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel.
It's the best way you can support the two of us and help the channel continue to grow.
And with that said, on with the show.
Welcome to the Untangling Web3 podcast. So typically, I think we talk about easy to understand technologies, practical use cases, how this is going to affect people in their everyday lives. But today, we're talking about a very big and futuristic sci-fi sounding topic that is space and the next frontier of space technology. I think people have been seeing Elon Musk in the news a lot recently, and some of the announcements he's been making around self-growing cities on the moon in the next 10 years, so not that far out. So I think it's worth us taking some time to actually dive into what he's talking about, what is possible in this space, and what the next 5 to 10 to 20 years looks like.
Yeah, it's not our usual fare, as the Pythons once famously said, now for something completely different. But yeah, this is cool. I think it's something that I definitely haven't followed enough. I think the last thing I remember hearing about space was when Katy Perry famously went up there in the in the Jeff Bezos.
Did you kiss grass or something? Come back down and kiss grass.
Yeah, it was weird. I think that's an episode we all need to forget. But yeah, I think there have been some interesting murmurings, and I think it's good to cover what the latest developments are, especially given how they relate to AI and the use of kind of data centers in space potentially. So yeah, I'm intrigued. I know you've done a lot more research for this one, Alec. You've been prepping for today. So yeah, I'm excited to see what you've come up with.
Months and years of prep. I think that the reason we're talking about this today, like I said, is one of the things that Elon Musk has been talking about a lot over the past 5-10 years has been the idea of us colonizing Mars. That has been something that he kind of put at the center of his SpaceX strategy for the last 10 years. Some of the reasons are a bit more vague, like the idea of having humanity's consciousness spread out as much as possible to make it as, I guess, kind of resilient as possible and all this kind of stuff. And classic Elon Musk fashion, he's overpromised, underdelivered. He kind of, where are my Tesla taxis on the streets? Still haven't got them. But what he has said now is the moon is far more achievable, and we're actually going to target the moon and getting people to the moon in this self-growing city in the next 10 years. And he also wants to target the idea of an uncrewed lunar landing by 2027.
Yeah, this isn't the first time Elon Musk has said to the moon, right? it's been all about crypto before. But yeah, obviously I know what SpaceX is, and the fact that it's a big part of his, Tesla, the Tesla, SpaceX, Musk sphere, the empire. But yeah, I've never really been entirely aware of what the goal is beyond. I always kind of assumed it was just around commercial space travel or commercial space flight, and the idea of not basically NASA not being the only way that people are going to get to space, and that people might pay to go, for a trip around the moon or something. And this seems quite different. This idea of colonizing, I say far off planets. I mean, very close by planets on cosmological scales. But yeah, so this is an interesting development. What is the rationale that he's giving for wanting to colonize beyond just maybe like a big stunt?
I mean, I think his the thing I like about Elon Musk is I do think he has grand, lofty ambitions. Whether they're actually beneficial for humanity is up for debate, but I think he thinks they are, and to an extent, I agree with this one. He wants to put humanity on out there as far as possible on as many self-sustaining independent bastions as possible, so that if something does happen, like for example the climate crisis gets to a point where our oceans boil and we can no longer live on Earth, then we have Mars or Moon as a backup, so humanity continues and survives. I am glad you brought up the idea of like the Elon Musk empire, because he obviously has his finger in many pies. Like we talked about Tesla, we've talked about obviously we're now talking about SpaceX. He also has the AI company, and it really really interesting development that we'll also talk about today is how two of these are starting to bridge. So the idea that SpaceX, you can kind of understand what it's trying to do, get people into space, Starlink, the idea of like how we can actually make satellites useful and commercial and all this kind of stuff. But then obviously the AI company as well. And there's been a lot of talks around these two companies merging and having their ambitions merge. And what's the overlap there? Well, one of the overlaps is the idea of an orbital data center. The idea of like, one of the things we're talking about constantly with AI and the kind of the acceleration of AI development is the need for big compute, for data centers that are very energy intensive, very water intensive to cool them down. And one of his ideas and one of the patents that he recently filed, less than 2-3 weeks ago, January 31st, was the idea of data centers that are out in space, referencing up to 1 million satellites powered by solar energy for AI data centers. So you can kind of see all these seemingly independent jigsaw puzzles are slowly forming into his idea of the Elon Musk sci-fi empire.
Yeah, just wants to escape and start again.
Upload himself to something.
Yeah, and transmit his conscience across the stars.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I think I'm really glad you mentioned the data centers, because that I think is a really concrete example of why, exploring further into space, spending more time in space, doing stuff in space does make a lot of sense, right? And from my understanding, the arguments, from a simplistic view, are essentially abundance of energy. So you if you have solar powered systems, solar powered data centers that can float in space, then they obviously have access to energy much more efficiently. Right? They can get sunlight directly; it doesn't go through the Earth's atmosphere. You're closer to the sun, so it's higher intensity. So it makes sense from an energy usage perspective, and it's also it's essentially energy that isn't really being used currently. It's just being emitted through the cosmos. And then the cooling side, as you mentioned. So obviously, for anyone who didn't do their high school physics, space is a vacuum, which means it's very, very cold. It's around, I think it's around minus 270 degrees Celsius, which is near zero, near absolute zero. So you get this, I think they call it passive radiative cooling. So basically, you can put stuff up there. You don't have to, like, when we talked a while ago about Bitcoin mining, and the fact that I went to go and see one of these cool Bitcoin mining rigs in Wales that was being cooled by that kind of baby fluid or baby oil fluid type thing, like a conductive liquid. But liquid cooling is like very common in data centers, or in specifically the Bitcoin mining case. That's one thing you can do. In space, you don't have to do that, right? The medium is already so because liquid is the medium, right? In that case, in space, the heat just radiates away, and you also don't have to worry too much about where that heat's going. Before you get to a crazy scale of doing these things in space, it can just go off in all directions into the ether, essentially. So those are like really two concrete reasons for putting technology in space. I completely kind of get that. It's interesting where, as you say, it fits into this bigger picture of his plans.
Yeah, and I think like just to come back to why then the moon, I think that you kind of, it's a big lofty ambition, a vague ambition to talk about putting your consciousness and humanity all over the stars and whatnot. But also there are resources that we are starting to maybe plateau in some of the resources that Earth has to offer in terms of landmass, in terms of like critical minerals, all these kind of things. You occasionally hear the idea of like a comet going past that has 50 trillion worth of gold and all this kind of rare minerals and rare materials on there. But how do we get there? And I think this is kind of one of the leading reasons why people are interested in starting to build a city or a kind of a station out on the moon, is because it offers this kind of, I guess, a staging ground for deep space. Like, it actually, even though we have done it many times, it's actually really difficult to get spaceships, surprise, surprise, out of Earth's atmosphere. We have a big gravity compared with the moon, which is 1/6 of the gravity. So obviously that means that less power and there's a lower escape velocity required to get off the moon. So if you could build like a staging station where you host, I don't know, spaceships and things like that, and kind of have a mini NASA out there, it would make it far more cost effective and efficient to actually use that and explore deep space from there. There's a theorem around like Earth's velocity, the velocity it requires to get past the gravitational pull, and actually like the more weight you have, the more fuel you're required to overcome that weight and have the power to get past it, and then the more fuel you need then to go past the mass. And it's kind of like this cycle of you can only have a limited payload. So in the concept of trying to get to Mars and habitize it, create habits out there? How do we start to move mass components, steel beams, all the things we need to create these structures when we don't have a very big capacity for most spaceships? And these are things that we're starting to discuss, hopefully, in this episode anyway.
Yeah, I mean that's interesting because that's, I guess, maybe a blind spot. I don't quite understand why it improves the situation by getting to the moon first. Is it the idea that so you'd, instead of doing a one shot from Earth to Mars, and as you say, the more mass you're trying to transport and help escape the Earth's atmosphere or the Earth's gravitational field, that escape velocity you need to hit, you need more energy, more power to do that. So if you're trying to do it all in one go, it's it's probably infeasible. But getting you to the moon, does that imply that then you have to start building piece by piece things on the moon to then essentially recreate, like, I don't know, a rocket launching station from the moon, right? And start
Exactly.
harnessing energy from the sun, but on the moon. Is that the idea?
Exactly. Like, one of the problems with big spaceships right now is that the vast majority of the weight is actually fuel. So if you can start to build this station on the moon where they get most of their fuel and maybe even additional components from the moon, then it makes it far easier for them to have really big payloads to then go into deep space. So one of the things that is required for rocket fuel is water and ice, and they've confirmed that there is water in permanently shattered craters on the moon. So this can be split down into hydrogen and oxygen, which makes the propellant, the fuel that they can actually be used to then power the spaceship. So that is a large part of why you'd want to use the moon as a staging ground. Less gravity, easier to escape, so you can go for much bigger spaceships, assuming they're assembled or fueled from the moon in the first place.
Interesting. Just as you were speaking, you're also making me wonder, like, is another argument for going to the moon generally as a place you can test things out? Like, I don't know, like nuclear fusion reactors or different types of
Yeah.
energy source. Is that an idea? Because you can do it away from being able to harm other people, essentially. I've never actually thought about that
100%.
before, but
And there's
yeah.
like there's the weird bit around like space. Obviously, there's lots of space out there. Everything on the world now is owned by someone, so you have to pay and all this kind of stuff. And the safety aspect, less people, so you can test, say, more, I don't know, like nuclear materials out there and whatnot, but also regulation, like the laws that kind of hold
Mm.
humanity, like the UN conventions and humanitarian conventions and whatnot, don't necessarily apply on the moon. So it's kind of like you can test things maybe a bit more ambitiously or a bit more recklessly on the moon that you couldn't necessarily test on Earth.
Yeah, I mean, that's another question. Who has jurisdiction over the moon? That's
Well,
that's
this is
that's a
another
big one,
reason
right?
why it's happening is the defensive play. Even if people
Mm.
aren't sure why they want the moon, the very fact that China and Russia want the moon means the US wants the moon, just in case, even if we don't know how to use it right now, in 5 to 10 years, we might use it for a Death Star or something like this.
Wow, we're getting into some weird stuff already. I mean, honest, because for me, one of the interesting questions, okay, jurisdiction of the moon aside, and that's, I imagine will be just. I don't know if there is any legal kind of precedent for it, right? Because obviously, you've got the International Space Station, which is like a cooperative
Mhm.
project, and there's I guess there's some kind of alliance around that and how you do that, joint space missions across the various uh I guess space programs across the world. So there was
Mm.
already an idea of cooperation, and but yeah, who knows how that applies to what happens when if you start thinking in the idea of colonizing the moon. But the other question that comes to my mind is, like, what do you feel how do you feel about the idea of private companies doing this stuff? Because again, ISS is like, generally, the space programs are government mandated things, right? But then you talk about SpaceX, and was it last year that they rescued the astronauts from one of the
Mm.
satellites? Maybe it was the ISS, the ones who've been stranded there. And that was, like, for me, that was a bit of a watershed moment. I say I can't remember anything since Katy Perry. I do remember this. The fact that you had a private company, SpaceX, successfully extracting the astronauts, bringing them back down off their own back, like not as a government sponsored thing. I was
Mm.
like, wow, that's a bit of a watershed moment, right? And but how do you? I don't know if I feel completely comfortable with the idea of private companies starting to do this stuff if they are going to go and offer a commercial space flight, start going to colonize planets on their own. Like, do you have an intuition for that?
I guess my feeling is you you can't really have innovation without privatization. I think that all innovation, or almost all good innovation, comes from privatization, but that doesn't necessarily mean like human ethics and morality are taken into account. So I think a balance between the two, where it's like funding and overall goals are determined by governments, especially when it comes to things as vague and ambiguous as space, but the actual development and innovation and competitiveness comes from private companies. So like this kind of fits in quite nicely with one of the reasons why this has kind of come to the forefront again, is that the US, or NASA, sorry, has a new program called the Artemis Gravity Program, which is basically a new bit of regulation or statements around financial, political, and industrial contracts that will go out for the next 2 to 3 years that basically guarantee that we'll be funding. Like if we look at SpaceX, they're not idiots. Like they're not just going to start building on the hope that one day they'll be able to make money in 20, 30 years time. So the funding is definitely going to come from governments to build out these capabilities and say, okay, if you can pitch for XYZ to a certain degree, then we'll give you funding for the next 2 or 3 years. So the US and NASA specifically has guaranteed there will be guaranteed funding for specific milestones related to the colonization of Mars, related to refueling stations in space. And like I say, Elon Musk is now pitching to be the company with SpaceX that will deliver those innovations.
Right, interesting. Because I've never really thought actually about the business model of SpaceX. I thought, maybe it's just a big kind of almost marketing play for Elon Musk, and in the style of almost like blitzscaling as well, like not turning a profit potentially. But is it maybe the case that the play is actually about government contracts? Is that what you're saying? Like they are
It's
expecting
both,
to make
right?
money that way, or
It's both, right? He's kind of assuming the short. I think what he's doing is assuming the short term is government funding, government contracts for the ability to have capabilities for NASA. But then long term, there's a lot of value add. Like for example, he was putting satellites into space a long time ago. It's only been in the last three-ish years that Starlink has started to get really heavy numbers. Like at first, those two things probably weren't thought of as interrelated, but he developed the capabilities and then the business model came afterwards. In the same way that he'll be using, I assume, government funding through SpaceX to build out these capabilities, the idea of refueling stations, the idea of potential cities and refueling stations and habitats on the moon. And then you can quickly see like how that could be like privatized and made into like a profitable business when other countries, other agencies, other companies want to start doing deep space exploration for whatever reason, be it research based, be it the idea of deploying their own AI data centers in space, be it looking at comets and trying to harness some of the resources there. Like it wouldn't surprise me if that is one of the end goals outside of the humanitarian, just putting consciousness on the moon.
okay, so they want to go out and find the comet that's full of gold, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
mine it. Yeah. Okay, cool. And also, I guess touching back on the data centers point earlier, that there's a clear dovetail here to AI, right? And one of the other prongs of Elon Musk's empire with XAI. So
Mhm.
that's the hottest ticket in town in terms of compute right now, right? Is AI training, AI models, how they're used. So do you think that will also factor into his play in thinking about colonizing Mars and the moon, and where the data centers go? Do you think he's already planning to transition them all off world, as it were?
Well, definitely. Like I said, it's now the 17th of February. So 3 weeks ago, SpaceX, sorry, filed a patent around the orbital data center, which is a concept that kind of included language mostly around the idea of developing extremely large scale orbital data centers in space. And there was some details around what they would potentially look like, how many there would be, like in the order of millions. Basically, getting their energy from the sun, because obviously there's less obscurity, you get more direct sun rays, so it's more efficient. The cooling aspect that you spoke to earlier, right now we need lots of water to cool these, lots of wastage. Like I said, lots of water demand costs money. Using it in space, you can use different types, but like I guess one of the main ways is to radiate that heat directly into space. You talked about like it being super cold, but obviously also there's no atoms out there, so you don't get traditional kind of heating as we would imagine. And the other big thing about like other big justification for doing this is like regulation. Like it's really hard to build data centers, just clear lots of land. There's lots of
Mm.
resistance to develop, I don't know, green space or whatever, especially in the West. Out in space, you've got a lot of space, so it's actually completely fine. So there's lots of reasons why you might want to do this. And I guess right now they're just exploring the business models, but throwing a patent at it straight away to make sure that it's a protected endeavor.
That's a really interesting angle, right? Because you think, okay, we were saying about the business model of SpaceX. Is that going to be just a lot of capital expenditure and opex to, create effectively easier space flight and easier ways to, go out and do things in near Earth orbit, for example? If the play is then on data centers, then you can see how all that expenditure becomes, there's a return on that investment when you start putting data centers there, because then those are data centers that if you can make the space travel cheap enough, then maybe the cost of flying them up there and setting them up in a near Earth orbit becomes, cheaper than the land needed you need to acquire to set up
Exactly.
the equivalent compute, right? So that actually maybe the two businesses will dovetail financially and from a business model perspective, and if that's true.
Exactly. I think that's the thing. Is like there are some definite obvious benefits, like the idea of 100% uptime, guaranteed solar power. Obviously, right now, wherever you are, you're guaranteed like 8 hours as a minimum in most places anyway. That you won't
Just
see the
like the
sun up
UK.
in just like the UK, 24 hours of no sun ever. Whereas in
Yeah.
space, you can guarantee that you'll have 100% sun power like coming through. There are benefits there, but the big downside right now is the cost. It's obviously prohibitively expensive to get things up in space, and just buying a piece of land in the West is probably cheaper right now. But he's betting on the future where using all the techniques they've built to manufacture satellites in Starlink, using like the funding that they're guaranteed basically for getting people to the moon, like they'll start to build this in-house knowledge and this capability to put things out in space for much cheaper, much more effectively than it would be to put a data center on Earth, which is a bit mind-boggling, like to think of it.
Well, I'm also now wondering, I can bet what will happen to the e-waste, right? Because there's a lifespan for the actual chips and GPUs and things that get used. They get burned out, and
Mm.
even if you can increase the lifespan of them, make them more efficient, because of the cooling, etc., in the vacuum of space, I do then wonder cynically if what's the solution instead of flying rockets back up to take it down and recycle them. It's probably going to be we're going to just increase the velocity a little bit, let it slip out of the orbit, go into the deep void of space, and that's our recycling. I mean, I
And
can
then
imagine.
the aliens find us and take over the world and think that we're all AI. I wonder if there's also an angle of like, because there's no, well, that much fewer atoms, if not no atoms in space. I imagine that the life cycle of components out in space is probably a fair bit higher. I'm not sure
Yeah,
exactly if that's
I'd
true,
imagine
but
so.
I
Yeah,
imagine that makes sense. But like right now, data centers are already, like considering that AI only came onto the scene like 2-3 years ago, really in a big way, are consuming around 1 to 2% of global electricity. So, and this stuff is not going to go away. It's obviously going to become more important, more prevalent. So that energy consumption is just going to go up and up and up. So it's not too ridiculous to understand why they're going for these left of field methods to kind of get around that stuff. And another big thing that I hadn't thought about as well was the idea of sovereignty. Like right now, imagine basing your military or your government process or your electricity grid on an AI data center. You want to make sure that that thing is locked down. Like how many people are there that can operate out in space if you have a data center there? So that's another angle that people are also
yeah.
starting to kind of think about when they think governments building data centers out in space.
Yeah, and I'm as a someone who worries, I'm always like, well, what if there's a war and one of the big targets of the data centers, that's an easy way to take out a lot of infrastructure for communications, and I'm wondering like, is it easier to defend in space or harder? Because do you need defenses to be placed out in space as well? And then it would get really crazy if you've got US data centers here, other countries over here, and then they've got defense flying around with them. I can imagine that would get pretty scary pretty quickly too.
Yeah, it is all a bit bonkers. Like, I think this, I mean, they only filed the patent like 2-3 weeks ago. This stuff
Yeah,
is still really far
it's a
off.
lot
Like,
of noise from a patent. Yeah,
it is a lot of noise. I mean, Elon Musk obviously almost always over promises. Like, I do think he tends to deliver on what he says, but it takes like 2 to 3 times like the amount of time that he actually kind of suggested at the start. So, this stuff, I think his intent is quite clear. I can imagine it happening, but it's not going to be for like 30 years, surely. Like, he's saying that they want to have this self growing city in the next 10 years, and they want to have the idea of an autonomous satellite, an autonomous space device going to the moon without a human controller in the next 2 years. So like there are some big ambitions coming out. It'd be interesting to see like how many of them actually happen on time.
Yeah, and it's probably worth just checking in on everyone else. Like, is Elon Musk the only one doing this? Like, beyond NASA and I guess the governmental space programs, like obviously lots of countries have them, or at least a few. But we mentioned Jeff Bezos earlier and his Katy Perry flight. Are they also playing in that? Like, or is Elon Musk the only one seriously, trying to achieve these aims right now?
Well, this is one of the, like I said, this is why I think like private endeavors always breed kind of innovation through competition. Yeah, Blue Origin's still playing in the space. Like they've obviously gone down the commercial route of the idea of like offering, like I said, the Katy Perry style trips into low Earth orbit and whatnot, and that's got a lot of like marketing and media attention. They are also competing for NASA grants. Like SpaceX is definitely the leading bidder and contractor for NASA, but it's not to say that Blue Origin isn't competing in that space. And there are other startups like slowly starting to emerge in that space as the kind of like that's one of the reasons why NASA did this Artemis 3 program, which kind of sets out these guaranteed contracts and funding for the next 2 to 3 years, has meant that lots more people are starting to pitch the ideas of being a competitor to SpaceX. But yeah, SpaceX is definitely the leading private company in this space by far. When you talk about other people that are kind of pushing into this space, like the two big competitors for space exploration and space technology is definitely China and Russia. Like China more recently because of the funding, they have been doing a lot in the last 10 years. And Russia obviously historically has a massive well, I guess previous experience with this stuff. They are advancing plans to build an international lunar research station, which again is basically going to be like the equivalent of the International Space Station, but on the moon. I think their plans for going through that are in the 2030s. I don't think they're actually confirmed to any date right now, but they're also looking to build a habitat on the moon in the 2030s.
Right. So it's all going to start happening in the next 10, 20 years. It's scary.
Well, exactly. Like that's why NASA kind of put this stuff out, is because even though they don't know why they might want it, they know that other people want it. So that means that they also want it. Like, and if you are going to be an absolute pessimist about this, then the obvious implications are around like defense and having like a moon space military base or something like that where you can shoot this Death Star at the Earth. Like that isn't too surprising in the modern age.
Yeah. I mean, it's just all, it seems like the stuff of science fiction, right? But I guess, and one of the things I've kind of is a bit of a gap in my head, but obviously the first steps of space exploration happened 60 plus years ago at this point, and then it seems like there's been a huge hiatus in between. So since the original space race, right, and people trying to put man on the moon, it doesn't seem like a huge amount has happened until those private companies have almost started to push the agenda, as you said. So maybe there's a lot of sense to what you're saying. And I mean, would you say that the private companies have essentially reignited this? Like, is this more coming from them than any of the international? Because obviously, I guess in America it's the private companies, but it sounds like in Russia, China, that's still more kind of a governmental thing.
I mean, like the space race back in like the 1960s, the US was spending 4.4% or around 5% of its total spending on NASA, on the space race. So that is like a huge amount.
Crazy.
And that was mostly because of Russia also wanting to be in space. And like it was mostly around one, there was the kind of the media angle, the marketing angle, who's the dominant player, like same with the Olympics, you have to show you the best on stage, but also the military angle, like the same technology you're building for NASA, technologies you can use in aerospace, technologies you can use for the military. And the reason so much money went into that was because of the Soviet Union. Like they were competing. There was these two major dominant global players fighting to be number one. And that's why so much money went into it. So much advancement happened during that era. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, there was no competitor to the US for like 30, 40 years. So there was no need to kind of put the funding into that space. That's changed now. China, India, like it's becoming a multipolar world. There are other people competing in that space. And again, competition breeds innovation as China starts to push more and more, and even India and the EU to an extent. to push satellites and to push the frontier of space. The US is now, in a reactionary way, pushing companies through private endeavors, like SpaceX kind of saw this coming 20, 30 years ago, but pushing companies through public funding to be the innovators to push this frontier tech out again. So I think we are going to see like another golden era of space exploration in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And again, the reason is because we're moving from this unipolar world of just the US being the dominant tech player to a multipolar world where people have to compete and you can't just sit on your laurels. You have to do something.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see if America has lost its position in the intervening 50, 60 years as the dominant force. Maybe they won't win the next space race.
Let's see. It depends how close China and Russia stay. Like Russia has the experience, the know-how, the expertise. China has the funding, the money, the up and comer, as it were. Whereas the US has a bit of both. So it'd be interesting to see like how it plays out. But like this space, I think I saw an estimate that from I think it was Morgan Stanley or McKinsey, that the commercial space market by 2040 will reach around $1 trillion yearly. So like this is not going away.
Commercial space market referring to like people like you and I wanting to fly, or is that something?
No. Like Starlink style. People like companies wanting to put satellites out in space for some gain, like that kind of stuff. I think the best things we can think of are like AI data centers, Starlink style comms, Wi-Fi, that kind of stuff. But like you can imagine, it's going to be like the idea of selling pickaxes during the gold rush. Like they will be the operator. Someone will come to a SpaceX and say, I want to do X with your rocket ships. Can you put this out in space, or can I piggyback off Starlink to do Y? And they will rent out the service rather than doing it all themselves end to end.
Makes sense. And to be honest, I can't think of an enterprise or a goal that is more suited to monopoly than space exploration and putting things into orbit, because I feel like you'd want a single trusted name in that game, right? So yeah, it would make sense for people like SpaceX to try and be the first mover, be the first trusted name in doing that. Which, again, that mission last year where they recovered, essentially government employees and NASA astronauts who've been stuck up there for like over a year or something. Like that there's not much of a better way of proving that you're a trusted brand than doing that. And I can't imagine you wanting to go shopping around for your space exploration vehicle and you just be like, no, that's the one that works. I want to use that. So yeah, maybe it does make sense to go in early.
It depends though. Like I guess we're coming at it from the Western angle. Like I think as kind of like the globalized world order kind of breaks down a little bit, if that continues to happen, there's no way that China's going to trust SpaceX or like India's going to trust China and all that kind of thing. I think each country and each sovereign nation or sovereign bloc will have their own joint venture, and like some of them will be very successful, like SpaceX. Some of them maybe not so. And I think everyone will want, because this is going to be a core infrastructure, right? Everyone will want their equivalent that they depend on, and they don't trust the others. So I think there'll be a monopoly in kind of
within
our world, maybe. Exactly. That's how I think it'll play out.
Yeah, and I imagine it will also be quite two or three non-overlapping monopolies as well. That'll be quite separate, I'd imagine. But yeah,
exactly.
Interesting. Cool. Well, I've definitely learned something. I've rejogged some of my physics brain. I think it's the optimistic phase of space exploration and the second space race, right? Like I think the good stuff will happen first, the exciting, interesting stuff. And then some of those more worrying implications that we mentioned before, maybe they'll come in 20, 30, 40 years. But yeah, I'm glad we picked up on this, and thanks for reminding me to think about space, Alec.
Never stop thinking about space. I think if we're going to reach human civilization going across the stars, then we need people like Elon Musk, unfortunately, to get us there. I think the space...
I have to ask you, Alex, sorry, who will play Elon Musk in the sequel to Interstellar that is inevitably based around this?
It's got to be Matt Damon, surely.
That'll just be too confusing because they'll be like, well, he's come back from Mars. So
exactly, he's back out there. Thanks for listening to this episode on the frontier of space. Watch this space in the future. And thanks for listening to wherever you may be. And join us next time to untangle a little more of Web3. Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Untangling Web3.
Don't forget to like and subscribe and to follow us on social media. It really does help us out.
The views we express here are our own and do not reflect the views of our employers.
And with that, we'll see you next time.